Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Frederick. I am an assistant professor with the Department of History and Art History, and my research focuses on the economic history of Sub-Saharan Africa. So today I'm going to be discussing the importance of incorporating an environmental perspective into research on the economic history of the continent. So in both historical and contemporary terms, the natural environment figures particularly heavily in the daily lives of most inhabitants of the continent because it's today still predominantly rural and thus closely attuned with seasonal fluctuations, which I'll talk about today. So I'm going to begin by briefly discussing this relationship between rural communities and the wet and the dry seasons, which in turn determine the timing of agricultural seasons, which we refer to as seasonality. I'll then move on to discuss a case study of how changing seasonality in Malawi's Lower Shire Valley helped influence quite profound economic change as villagers in the region responded to changing environmental conditions. All right, so 65% of sub-Saharan Africa's population relies on subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is basically agricultural production that is primarily intended to feed one's own family. So under a system of subsistence agriculture, successful harvests basically become a matter of life and death. So as a result of this very strong reliance on subsistence agriculture, African communities are thus extremely reliant on the natural environment, as you can imagine. And this is even more so given that in sub-Saharan Africa, 95% of agriculture is still rain-fed. So this means that there is no, for the most part, irrigational infrastructure. So in most of sub-Saharan Africa, seasonality is thus starkly defined by what are, for obvious reasons, termed the wet season, as you see here, very lush, and the dry season, which affected both the landscape, as you can see in this image, but also affects the flow of rivers, which provide access to water and also provide fertile riverbed lands to farmers when the waters recede so they can actually grow some crops on these. So taken all together, this basically means that the rhythm of life for sub-Saharan African farming communities is very much determined by the seasons. For example, Malawi experiences a very long sustained rainy season. For basically half the year, about 6 months from mid-November to mid-April. This is followed by a 6-month extremely dry season where we see almost no rain from May to October, so another 6 months. And perhaps you're thinking, well, we also have quite some rainy periods in the Netherlands too, so we also have seasonality, and that's of course true. But if we look at a side-by-side comparison of the rainfall patterns in Malawi versus Utrecht, we can see just how stark these differences in the seasons are in sub-Saharan Africa. So in the Netherlands, rain falls pretty much continuously throughout the year, and it never reaches more than 75 millimeters per month. This compares with the nearly 250 millimeters reached during the peak rains in Malawi. So as a result of this, the rhythm of life in sub-Saharan Africa for these farming communities basically is dictated by these seasons, and so is the way that they allocate their labor throughout the year. So during the dry season, which is sometimes referred to as the non-agricultural or slack season, mostly non-agricultural tasks are carried out. This might be things like hut building or mending fences and weaving. Although depending on the context, some agriculture may also be carried out, as we will actually see in our case study of Malawi's Lower Shire Valley. Meanwhile, during the wet season, which is often referred to as the agricultural season, The careful timing of very vital agricultural tasks is really crucial for the survival of subsistence farming communities. And in fact, we see that these communities are extremely sensitive to changes in seasonal weather conditions. So we've seen some recent examples of how very rapid changes in seasonality caused by weather shocks can lead to catastrophe as the seasonality sort of goes out of whack. So a very recent example is 2018, when floods raged across East Africa, as a year of extreme drought in 2017 was immediately followed by excessive rainfall, leading to a humanitarian crisis throughout the entire region. Similarly, back in 2015, the wet season, so the rainy season in Malawi and Mozambique, a bit further to the south, came much later than usual. And then when it did come, the rains were too fast and they were too heavy, basically flooding croplands, destroying homes, and displacing hundreds of thousands of people, and at the same time creating really widespread food insecurity because crops could not be produced as they normally would be. So given this very strong relationship that we've seen between rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa and these seasonal fluctuations in the natural environment, the question for historians arises, how exactly do changes in seasonality affect the socioeconomic organization of rural communities? So in simple terms, how do they cope with and respond to changes in seasonal circumstances? To explore this relationship, I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk on the case study of the Lower Shire Valley in Malawi, where there was a sustained change in seasonality that occurred over the course of several decades during the 19th century and helped influence some considerable economic shifts that took place in rural villages during precisely this period. So specifically, we're going to see how seasonality changes, coupled with simultaneous demographic changes in the area, interacted. And they ultimately helped produce a significant shift in the way that households in these villages allocated their labor throughout the year. What ends up happening is that textile manufacturing, which was traditionally carried out during this so-called non-agricultural dry season, basically ends up being completely abandoned quite quickly. Meanwhile, at almost the same time, labor is being increasingly channeled into agriculture, not only for subsistence, so feeding your own family, but also for the first time in this region's history, labor is being applied to cash crop agriculture. That is the growing of crops to sell on global markets. So we're going to have a close look at how these really substantial economic shifts in this area that totally altered the way that households divided up their annual labor were related to environmental changes in the region. First, to give a little bit of a broader context about this, this case study comes from a recent book that I published, which explored when and why traditional textile industries declined in East Africa. For many, many decades, the traditional argument about why this occurred has come from what's called deindustrialization theory. This theory basically focuses on external global forces as the cause of a decline in textile industries throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Deindustrialization theorists generally assume that these textile industries in Africa disappear primarily as a result of a rise in cloth imports from industrialized countries like Europe, the United States, India. And the theory basically goes that competition from imported cloth during the 19th century essentially leads African textile producers to abandon that industry and instead turn their labor toward what is considered to be more profitable cash crop production to sell to global markets. So this is the sort of traditional story. However, I conducted a number of case studies And I found that the story ends up being a lot more complicated. Instead of focusing primarily on these global forces, so imports of cloth, local factors actually end up being very important. And we find that there are different outcomes and different causes of industrial decline in different localities throughout East Africa. So this is where that case study of Malawi comes from. And as we'll see for the case of the Lower Shire Valley, local environmental and demographic changes prove extremely important in the decision-making of households in the region's villages. All right, so as you can see here, the Lower Shire Valley lies in the southern tip of what is today Malawi. Here, textiles were produced by households, and they were regionally traded in the area from the 16th to the mid-19th centuries. This is a quite robust industry that had developed. But between the 1860s and 1880s, all of a sudden, this industry virtually disappears quite rapidly from the area. And at the same time, we see this region beginning to start growing oil seeds, so sesames, not only for subsistence, but also for global export, which is a very new activity in this region. And in the context of a rural community, this is really a profound economic change. So, of course, the question is, why does this happen? Now, if we follow the logic of the deindustrialization theories, this should have something to do with a major increase in cloth imports into the region during this period of industrial decline. But if we actually look at cloth import figures, which I have here, it becomes pretty clear that the period of industrial decline indicated in the red box was actually long before textile imports would show a massive increase into East Africa more generally, but also specifically into Malawi. This would only occur in the first half of the 20th century, which is long after the industry had disappeared. So the data would suggest that it's quite unlikely that textile imports caused this decline of the Lower Shire Valley's industry. So then let's have a look at the second part of the argument that's made by theorists who focus on global markets. That is that the profitability of cash crops is really driving the decision of households to abandon industries and instead focus on cash crop exporting. What we see here are the terms of trade for oil seeds. Terms of trade essentially reflect the real prices that farmers could obtain for exported oil seeds relative to imported manufacturers. So it's essentially a sort of exchange value. And what we see here is that profits for globally exporting oil seeds really only show a significant rise in the last years of the century. But again, just like cloth imports, this occurs long after the industry in the Lower Shire Valley had already disappeared. So when we look at this data, it seems that neither cloth imports nor high potential profits from cash crop exporting was driving the significant economic changes that we see in the valley during the last quarter of the 19th century. And of course, to understand this, as I will show you, we need to look at local environmental and also demographic changes that occur in the region. All right, so let's have a look at what happens. Well, there are two major developments that occur simultaneously in this area. To begin with, from the late 1860s and into the 1870s, the region ends up being plagued by very violent, large-scale slave raiding, which completely disrupts village life. At the same time, this region also experiences really terrible famine conditions. This is partly related to production being disturbed by this slave raiding, but it's also related to a series of multi-year droughts that occur in the area. This ends up killing off a huge population, a portion of the region's population. So as a result of a combination of slave raiding, which takes a lot of people out of the area, and also this widespread famine, the region ends up losing a huge portion of its population, and in labor terms, this means its labor force, in a very short period of time. And in fact, the famous explorer of the region, David Livingstone, who had visited the area many times both before and after this period, reported the riverbanks, once so populous, are all silent, an oppressive stillness reigning where formerly crowds of eager sellers appeared with the various products of their industry. Labor had been completely swept away from the Great Shire Valley. Now, this is going to have major implications for the local textile industry, because producing cloth by hand requires a great deal of labor to not only cultivate the raw cotton, but also spin it into yarn and then weave the final garment. So if you see a significant decline in the local population, and thus a significant decline in the labor force, this means it's going to be fairly difficult to carry out an industry that requires a lot of labor. So this is that demographic change that I have been referring to. But this isn't the only thing that happens in the area during this period. Almost simultaneously, there is spontaneous environmental change that occurs in the area that is basically going to alter that seasonality that I've mentioned, around which rural communities base their annual economic activities. So what exactly happens here? Well, essentially, there is shifting rainfall patterns in Tanzania during the 1870s. This is going to lead to a massive decline in water levels of Lake Malawi just to the south. Now, Lake Malawi feeds into the Shire River, so this in turn leads to a massive decline in Shire River levels. So this is going to be a very important event in the history of the Lower Shire Valley, which is basically going to profoundly affect the way that households organize their labor from this point onward. But to understand how these changes so profoundly affected the valley, it's important to understand the nature of the geography and also the agricultural systems of this area. So let's have a look at this. As you can see in the map, the valley lies right along the Shire River, which you see indicated in these red arrows. During the 6-month wet season, when the rains fall, farming households in this area cultivated what are called dryland fields, located far from the river. But then during the dry season, villagers would undertake certain non-agricultural tasks, including weaving cloth, but they could also do some cultivation on highly fertile marshlands. These marshlands are basically fertile riverbeds, which are temporarily exposed each year during the dry season as the river declines due to a temporary absence of rain, like we saw in the images at the beginning of the talk. So because of these changing rainfall patterns that I mentioned in Tanzania, which affect the level of the Shire River, the intensity and length of this marshland exposure period is altered. So where these marshlands were available for cultivation for about 5 to 6 months per year before the 1870s, they start to be exposed for a considerably longer period of time between the 1870s and 1930s, actually reaching 9 and sometimes 10 months out of the year. So this means there's a lot more land available to farm in these communities for a longer period, which extends the length of the agricultural season. And what we can see here is actually the extent of how low the river becomes during this period, sometimes not even reaching a foot in depth. So this is a lot of available fertile land that suddenly arrives around the 1870s. So what this essentially causes, this demographic and environmental change happening in a fairly short period of time, it basically alters what economists refer to as the factor endowment ratio of the region, specifically the ratio of available land relative to available labor. So the availability of land goes up, the availability of labor goes down. Now, this would have a significant impact on the production choices that households end up making within this new context. The outcome will be that labor that was used to produce textiles in the pre-1870 period during the dry season ends up being largely reallocated to agricultural production on marshland, which is now available for longer periods during this dry season. But why exactly is this the case? Well, we have to look at the household economics here. Households make calculated choices on how exactly to allocate their labor to maximize their incomes and achieve survival. Now, when we see these demographic and environmental changes occur, this creates circumstances in which channeling the region's remaining diminished available labor into agriculture was simply a lot more feasible and economically rational than using that labor to continue industrial production. And this is true for a number of reasons. First of all, we have to think about the two products at hand. So sesame oil seeds on one hand and textiles on the other. Well, textile manufacturing is much, much more labor intensive. It's really a three-stage process. You have to grow the cotton, you have to weave the cotton into yarn, and then, or spin the cotton into yarn and then weave it into the finished product. So this requires a great deal of labor in the context of a community that has lost so much of its labor. Meanwhile, sesame oil seeds are a single stage process. You just have to grow them. And importantly, unlike raw cotton used to produce textiles, sesame oil seeds could be consumed by villagers as a food source, while any surplus could then be exported to European countries where the oil was demanded. Raw cotton can't be consumed. Now, this is a very important consideration for households that have just experienced a period of multi-year droughts and a great deal of famine. So spending their labor producing a food source is a more logical undertaking than spending their labor producing raw cotton for weaving. So in essence, what we see is that the use of scarce labor to produce cloth during the dry season had suddenly become much more expensive, since it basically entailed lost opportunities to produce agricultural goods on these marshlands during the now much longer agricultural dry season. So as a result, the cotton textile industry is basically abandoned by the 1880s during the now much longer dry season. And we see agricultural production taking up essentially the majority of the year in the lower Shire Valley from this point up until about the 1930s. There is a bit of a sad epilogue to all of this that I think really illustrates just how sensitive these riverside communities were to river level changes. There's again an environmental change that occurs in the area that's quite profound in the 1930s that similarly alters the ratio of available land to labor, and in turn alters the seasonal character of agriculture in the area. And this has pretty terrible consequences actually for the local economy, as we'll see. All right, so what happens is in the 1930s, this massive sandbar that is toward the south of Lake Malawi, just above the Shire River, collapses. And this had operated in a way as a sort of natural dam, limiting the amount of water that could flow into the Shire River at any time. So when this sandbar collapses, it sends massive amounts of water flowing into the Shire River to the south. And we can see here that the dry season river levels shoot up really high. And this creates a huge problem in the area, which is now completely reliant on agricultural farming on these fertile marshlands during most of the year. All of a sudden, these marshlands are no longer available. So without the availability of these marshlands, many of the region's men are basically forced to become migrant laborers to seek economic opportunities elsewhere, basically breaking up these households that had focused on riverbed cultivation for half a century. And in fact, today, this region remains very vulnerable to flooding during years of extreme rainfall. We actually see here the lower Shire Valley pictured in January 2015, inundated during those heavy floods of 2015 that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And we can see here that the crops that families would have used for their subsistence consumption are destroyed by the floods. So this area is still extremely precarious as a result of these environmental changes. All right, so I will wrap it up. What I hope to have illustrated here is the importance of incorporating environmental factors into studies of the economic history of Africa. As we've seen, African communities have been in the past and continue to be today really deeply intertwined with their natural environment, as we've seen here in the context of agricultural seasons and labor allocation choices of households and communities. So the environment is extremely important. However, the environment does not strictly determine historical trajectories. Instead, it interacts with a number of other factors. So we've seen in the case of the Lower Shire Valley that slave raiding, for example, depleted the region's labor force, and this played a role in altering household production choices within the context of these altered environmental conditions. And lastly, of course, we've seen that humans have a great deal of agency in coping with changes in their environment and deciding how they will reallocate and reorganize their annual labor in response to environmental changes. So thank you for your attention and for inviting me to the research parade. I look forward to any questions or comments you have. And also, if you are interested and want to talk further, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you so much for your interesting talk. I'll now read you out some questions that people asked, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so somebody asked, how do the people of the Lower Shire Valley describe these economic shifts? Surely they don't use the industrialization theory to explain their history.
That's a really good question. No, I don't think that they use the deindustrialization theory to explain this, given that for the people of the Lower Shire Valley, it's the local conditions that matter much more than these global forces. So for them, it's about responding to local changes that have occurred. And in fact, oral histories of the Lower Shire Valley suggest that there have been previous changes in the water levels of these regions, but this was not coupled with this demographic change that was caused by slave raiding. And so there wasn't this really profound economic shift away from producing textiles toward exporting products. So for them, I think this is much more an issue of local change and how communities have decided to respond to those changes.
Okay, thank you. This person then asked a follow-up question to that one, saying, is there merit in including their own version of the history of the area in research?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a historian, we try to get as many sources as we possibly can. And there's actually been a really beautiful book written on this very area called Work and Control that's based specifically on oral histories of people living in this area collected over the past 60 years. So absolutely, if we can combine oral histories with data on trade, things like this, we want to get the largest combination of sources that we possibly can. So I would absolutely encourage that of all historians.
I would agree. Then another question was, why do you think that we are only now looking at the environmental factors when studying the economic history of Africa?
I think that's a very good question. And I think it has a lot to do with broader shifts that we see in general in history and economic history as well. There has been more of a focus in the past, let's say 30, 40 years on cultural histories, sort of, a postmodernist perspective that has not incorporated, I would say, as much of a sort of structural approach, and the environment is very much part of that structural approach that we're starting to see being reinvigorated. So I think that it's really not African history per se that is changing. I think it's the field of history in general. It just happens to be that African economic history is so inundated with environmental factors because the environment is such a big player in the history of Africa. So it's really sort of a fruitful region to be incorporating this new environmental perspective into research.
Amazing. I actually have a question myself about this. You mentioned these global processes that are happening, and you kind of explained that this is not the only explanation. But is there still any value in looking at these global processes in explaining these local developments, and what is the role of these global developments in this?
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, global forces, of course, they affect everything about our everyday life, but they are not the only explanation. So if we look at this particular case study, we can see a number of places where global changes have affected what's going on at the local level. So I mentioned, for example, these slave raids. Well, this is very much connected actually to global demand for slave-produced commodities. So there are cloves, for example, being grown in Zanzibar, which is a small island off of the coast of East Africa. And slaves are captured from areas all over East Africa to be taken to Zanzibar to grow cloves. These are then sold to global buyers. Well, it is precisely this slave raiding that leads to a demographic change in the Lower Shire Valley and really influences what is possible for households in these areas. So there is always space for global-local interaction. But the material point is that global forces alone cannot explain changes that occur in different localities.
Thank you. There's one more question from someone, and that asks, what does this mean for post-colonial history?
In what sense?
They did not specify, but I think they would mean this research. How does this contribute to post-colonial history?
Well, I would say, if I understand where this question is coming from, I think a lot of the history of Africa has focused, at least I would say in the past 40, 50 years, has tended to focus on the effects of colonial rule on the continent, which is very real. But in this particular case, I think what's very interesting is that actually these changes occur before the colonial period. So Malawi is colonized as Nyasaland in 1891, and the decline of the textile industry actually occurs there before the colonial period begins. So where many scholars have focused on the effects of colonial rule on these regions and would say, well, these rising imports of cloth, which kill the local industry, are an effect of colonial rule, In this particular case, we actually see that this is a much more local process that occurs. So in a sense, I think it gives the area more of a history of its own. Instead of focusing exclusively on how Africa has been affected by the outside world, it also focuses, I think, on how Africa has created its own history in many ways, which I think should really be brought to the fore a lot more. And I think that is partly what post-colonial studies are trying to do.
Thank you so much for these answers and your presentation as a whole. It was extremely interesting. We don't have any more questions right now, so we're going to just start another small break, and then we will continue with Professor Dr. Johan Schot at 3:30. So thank you so much, and we'll hope to see you again at 3:30.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the questions.